In recent weeks, I have heard from so many listeners about one so-called journalist who works at the New York Times. His name has come up in passing here on the show. I've mentioned just a couple of his major journalistic failures, but I had not yet done any kind of deep dive into any of his work. His name is Ezra Klein. If you haven't heard of him, good. It would be much better to live in a world in which no one cares what dangerous lies and nonsense he is spewing any given day. But he is sadly reaching large numbers of people. And maybe most disturbingly, a few people I know thought that he was trustworthy. So today I will show you examples of how he regularly leaves out the two ingredients of truth, facts plus context, even though he claims to care oh so much about both of them. You'll hear what I mean ahead. Also today, more on something I told you about last week, Ronan Farrow's fact-checking failures in his wildly popular book. Today, I'll tell you what this means for The New Yorker. Also, a type of prejudice you should know about that people were trying to use to defend him. And I'll tell you about an event I did in New York with the awesome founder of the Me Too movement, Tarana Burke. All that plus your latest fantastic responses coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. So awesome to have you here. We got a lot to talk about today, so I'll limit the business at the top. I just want to say thank you so much to everyone tuning in and sharing the show and posting reviews on the big platforms, especially Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Here's one from Sarah. I always appreciate your fact-checking. So fact-checking the fact-checkers is more necessary than ever. I love it. Thank you. And I know what she means. Journalists should be fact-checkers, and they aren't. So they are the ones who need to be fact-checked. That sounded kind of like She Sells Seashells by the Seashore, didn't it? Whatever. Let's jump into this. So many listeners have been reaching out to me about Ezra Klein, and he uses his platform to spread so many anti-Israel lies. A bunch of listeners sent me this from an episode of his podcast that he just did. This is so disgusting. Take a listen.
Poll came out that was reported on by Haaretz, where 79% of Israeli Jews said they are not so troubled or not troubled at all by the reports of famine and suffering among the Palestinian population in Gaza. I'd seen another poll not long before saying that Israeli Jews felt that they had heard enough about the suffering in Gaza. And what chilled me so much about it, even beyond the level of suffering in Gaza, was the level of indifference that had gripped hearts of Israeli Jews.
Unreal. Literally, it's not real. And it's so offensive to describe this huge group of people as having indifference that gripped their hearts. Who is he to say this? All right, I'm going to get straight to the data for you because he does stuff like this all the time. Unlike him, I went and looked at what that survey he was talking about actually said. It came from a group called the Israel Democracy Institute. And it starts off with a finding about something that is essential for understanding the survey. The vast majority of Jewish Israelis believe that, given the circumstances of the fighting in Gaza, Israel is making efforts to avoid causing suffering to the Palestinian population there. All right, 78% of Jewish respondents in that survey said, given the reality of war, basically, Israel is making efforts. Now, if you get what you think is information only from big mainstream media in America, you will probably think that's crazy, that you know better, because that's how the Western media operates. But the people who were asked questions in this survey, hey, maybe they know some stuff that we don't. Most Israelis, especially most Jewish Israelis, served in the military, almost all of them. And it's a small country with people who are generally aware of their surroundings. So maybe, unlike people in America, they have seen the videos of restaurants that are still open in Gaza. Maybe they have seen the videos of people abusing their children in Gaza by getting them to eat dirt for video propaganda purposes. Maybe these folks polled are aware that Israel has sent in tons and tons and tons of food that the United Nations is refusing to distribute for political reasons, and that a lot of the food gets stolen by Hamas and other terrorists. Next, the people in this poll were not asked whether they care about people starving in Gaza. If you want to know whether people have indifference You can do a survey in which you say to them, if there is a person who is starving right now, do you care? That would give the kind of information that Ezra Klein is pretending this poll gave. That is not what they were asked. They were asked about reporting. This is so important, especially what it says about the media. To what extent are you personally troubled or not troubled by the reports of famine and suffering among the Palestinian population in Gaza? Just over half said they're not troubled by the reporting. That figure was 55.6%. Now, that could mean all kinds of things. It could speak to something people like to talk about often when it comes to Israel, which is the whole idea of a PR war. People say Israel is bad at PR or doesn't do PR. And it is the case that most people in Israel just don't worry so much about the reporting that other people are hearing. They're busy focusing on what day-to-day life is like, preventing terrorist attacks, focusing on political disputes. I've talked about this before, that democracies have a short-term perspective because they're always looking to the next election, the next move, the next way to pressure their leaders into doing what they want. While anti-democratic governments, like Hamas and all the Arab and Muslim governments, can take a long-term view. They don't have those pesky problems that democracies have. So these folks were asked about reports. Maybe they don't trust the reports. After all, the reports from Gaza are all based on claims from Hamas, which lies about everything. And there's more context for this. The hostages from Israel, people who are Jewish and not Jewish, different nationalities, different backgrounds, they have definitely been starved this entire time. Listen to something else that's so screwed up that Ezra Klein did in this same episode. Here he was talking about Israeli military action.
Is the point of this to get the hostages back? This is endangering the hostages. They are being starved alongside the Gazans.
What? They're being starved alongside the Gazans? No, the people of Gaza have been actively starving the hostages. It's not like there hasn't been enough food, and so the hostages are starving along with other people. That's just not what's been happening. Hamas recently released a video of Eviatar David. He was among those kidnapped from the Nova Music Festival. I was at the site of the festival in June. It's a literal killing field. You can see some photos of the people who were slaughtered there in my newsletter. Anyway, Hamas released a video of him recently, skin and bones, skeletal, clearly having been abused and being forced to dig a grave. He's barely recognizable. Hamas knew, of course, that the world would not care. The world is indifferent. Here's a clip from episode 45 of this show. Even with figures about how much food gets into Gaza, we cannot know how much actually gets to individuals because Hamas controls it. Also, the media never mentions this, but it's crucial to keep this in mind. Terrorists slaughtered people at that kibbutz. These were peacenik farmers who were trying to grow organic vegetables together with people in Gaza. They specifically attack people who are trying to help them grow food, which not that they have to help. I mean, there's been billions of dollars put into Gaza. They could be spending it on food instead of tunnels. But they slaughter these people and then scream famine. The whole thing is insane. But of course, no one should have to face famine. Anyway, I searched to see whether any mainstream news agencies had devoted any resources to exploring whether Israeli hostages were being starved in Gaza. And there's no sign that any did. AP headlines about starving in the region were about people who live in Gaza, not hostages. Over at NPR, I searched keywords, and everything that popped up was about Gazans starving. I finally found one piece.
We were taken to a house with terrorists that was so mean and so cruel.
This was Aviva Siegel, a teacher.
They used to starve us and eat in front of us.
Is anyone asking Gazans whether they care about the welfare of the people they are starving right there? Is anyone asking Hamas or Iran's other terror proxies how much they care about civilians in Israel they keep trying to bomb? There is no data showing indifference in the hearts of millions of Israeli Jews. That figure just doesn't exist. But that is only a tiny part of the context. Actual context is much broader. The Costs of War Project estimates that between 4.5 and 4.7 million people died as a result of the U.S.-led war on terrorism. after the 9/11 attacks. Many of these deaths were from famine, diseases that spread, instability. The group says more than 400,000 civilians were killed directly in those U.S.-led wars post 9/11. I went back and looked at about the same time frame, so nearly 2 years after 9/11, since the October 7th attacks were per capita much, much huger than 9/11. 2 years into America's response to al-Qaeda and the Taliban, how did Americans feel? Here is a quote from Gallup back then. There is a general acceptance on the part of Americans that civilian casualties may be a necessary part of war. In similar fashion, there is no strong sentiment at this time that the United States and its allies should be doing more to offer humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. At the time, the media was not fixating on the dire situation of Afghan civilians, even though, in many cases, it was dire. So, had indifference gripped the hearts of Americans? Or did we maybe understand what war is and what happens in war? This stuff only scratches the surface. Here's another clip from Ezra Klein at the New York Times. He said this about Israeli Jews.
Only a small and shrinking minority are still willing to entertain a Palestinian state.
He linked to a survey from Pew Research. I read it, and that is not what it says. They were asked whether they currently see a way to peaceful coexistence alongside an independent Palestinian state. And of course most don't. That has nothing to do with entertaining an idea. This gets at the basic reality that two-state solution has always been a misnomer. Having two states does not solve the problem. You can call Gaza and the Palestinian areas of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, you can call them a state, and they can still keep on carrying out terrorist attacks and radicalizing young people to grow up to be terrorists. How would that magically create peace? Now, if you're new to this show, you should know that in previous episodes, I have talked people through the actual history of these areas. And Israel already pulled out of Gaza 20 years ago, but the population there did not choose peace. It chose terrorism and war and no democracy. Yes, that is what people chose. In the Pew survey, people said they don't see a way for that to happen right now. And by the way, that includes a majority of Arab Israelis saying they don't see a way for that to happen either. Speaking of Arab Israelis, here's something else Klein said at the New York Times.
About 2 million Palestinians live inside Israel. They are, by any measure, second-class citizens.
That is a factually false statement. First, there's something linguistic you should know. The vast majority of surveys about this find that Israeli Arabs prefer the term Israeli Arab. If you go digging through a bunch of surveys, you can find some in which associations with the term Palestinian seem to have gained popularity. But in the bulk of these, it's a majority saying Israeli Arab. And that matters. To identify as Palestinian is to identify as part of a movement to create yet another Arab Muslim state. There are already more than 50 Muslim states, many of which have Sharia law in the government. But as for this thing about second-class citizens, we need to parse this to understand it. Members of any minority group in any democracy can feel like second-class citizens at times. But that's not what he said. And that's why what he said is fact-checkable. He said they are by any measure. That is a false statement. All citizens in Israel have equal rights. Israel is the first place in the entire Middle East and North Africa, MENA, to establish that concept. Under Arab and other Muslim nations, Jews were called dhimmis, never equal citizens, not even close. Israel factually has this.
The Israeli Declaration of Independence and our basic laws protect the rights of minorities in the state of Israel. We serve in the government, in the army, as doctors, professors, Supreme Court judges, athletes, journalists, and have equal rights under the law.
That is Yosef Haddad, an outspoken Israeli Arab. He had this video on LinkedIn.
I myself served in the IDF as a commander over Jewish soldiers, fighting against Hezbollah in Lebanon and against Hamas in Gaza. In sports, about 20% of the Israeli national football team are Arab Israelis. Hundreds of journalists openly and freely criticize the Israeli government, and their right to free speech is defended. Yes, it is possible to be both Jewish and democratic.
By the way, Arab and Muslim citizens of Israel are not required to take part in the military. So that is a difference, but definitely not a sign of second-class citizenship. This doesn't mean there aren't problems. Minorities face struggles, absolutely. But Ezra Klein is factually wrong. One of the most important measures, if not the most important measure, is what the law says. The list of things he gets wrong never stops. His podcasts and columns are filled with inaccurate data and no context. He was a founder of a website called Vox. I reported in a previous episode that Vox may have had the literal worst so-called explainer of Israel and Gaza after the October 7th attacks. It was filled with lies, which makes this all that much more ironic, or hypocritical, actually. He was interviewed on a show called Stay Tuned with Preet Bharara, and here is what Ezra Klein said.
Explanatory journalism is journalism and journalists focused on doing that, focused on figuring out how to put the context around information such that information fits into a framework in people's mind, such that they have what is needed to understand it. And yeah, I try hard to do it well.
That, by the way, was just part of his nonsensical rambling about context, in which he said nothing at all, but just used different words to tell you what the word context means. If this is what happens when he tries hard, we'd all hate to see what happens when he doesn't. There's one more thing you should know about him. It involves the idea of privilege. That is coming up. But first, the Farrow fiasco, how the media responded to Matt Lauer fact-checking Ronan Farrow, and why it shows how far the media has fallen.
Spin happens, you play it like a game, rewriting every chapter just to dodge the blame. Twist the story, pay me cold, but I won't fold, I won't lose control.
Here are just a few recent headlines from the newsletter that accompanies this show. 2 big things the media missed about Colbert. Media decries appeasement while demanding appeasement. And the media's geographic bias strikes again. The newsletter is designed for you. See, unlike the big legacy media, I don't expect or want you to take my word for anything. That is how I share links, figures, more information. The newsletter is free, and it takes time, energy, and money to put together this show and the newsletter. People who choose to become paid subscribers are making all that possible. They also get exclusive content. They send me ideas, feedback, requests for things to fact check. They are usually the ones who inspire the topics for each episode. And these supporters can have messages read on the show. This is from Maris. She writes, "You have an important, unique, facts-based platform that professional journalists should be using." She uses some capitals along the way. "We need to spread your objective, clear, honest mission. Thank you for offering this to us. Now we need to get your face in front of others to explain what's really going on. Keep up this important work, Josh." Thank you, Maris, and to everyone who's supporting the show. And I know so many people do video versions of podcasts these days. At this stage, I have found that getting this to you in audio form allows me to make it as tight and polished as I can. But if this show grows, I will do that. You can get visual content in the newsletter. You'll find a link in the show notes or at my website, joshlevs.com. Or the newsletter comes through a platform called Substack. If you're already on there, just look me up or look up They Stand Corrected. Last week, I told you how a story involving 3 former NBC employees offers a window into the giant toxic mess of mainstream media. It involved Matt Lauer, former host of The Today Show, Brooke Nebels, who worked in a different part of NBC and acknowledged having an ongoing sexual relationship with him, but as part of it accused him of non-consensual sex, of rape, and Ronan Farrow, who made her claims public through his book, Catch and Kill, but failed in basic fact-checking. If you haven't heard last week's episode, I encourage you to go back and check it out. Here is something Ronan Farrow said in the author's note at the start of his book.
It was subjected to the same standard of fact-checking as the New Yorker stories on which it is based.
So I reached out to the New Yorker. I asked whether his pieces for them were equally poorly fact-checked. You will be shocked to learn that I have not heard back. By the way, I myself, back when this book came out, made the mistake of believing the author's note and assuming that the book actually was fact-checked. I think I actually tweeted him something positive after first hearing the book. I learned my lesson not long after that when I saw what actually happened. When the word started to come out about Ronan Farrow's big fact-checking failures, some people tried to use his age as an excuse. He is apparently 37 years old now. The book came out almost 6 years ago. That stuff has to stop. It is a form of ageism called youngism. It's discrimination, including condescension, toward younger people. Just as no one should assume a younger person is incapable of doing something, no one should call age an excuse for very basic journalistic failures. I started on NPR when I was 24. I never expected to be treated by any different set of standards from anyone else, and I'm glad that I wasn't. Of course, I relied on great editors to be tough with me and help me learn. I specifically gravitated toward the editors who were tougher, because I knew I benefited from having a vertical learning curve. The age of a person doing the journalism is never an excuse for failing basic fact-checking. But the bigger problem I discussed last week is how the media runs into victim narratives. They overtook this. And in some cases, journalists put their cards on the table and openly stated that they had decided who was a victim. At Variety, I found a couple of stories from the time in which Variety itself referred to a Matt Lauer victim, including in a headline. They did not say alleged. They did not say so-and-so says. That's not how news works when you have allegations. Matt Lauer eventually put out a statement denying any non-consensual sex, any rape, and arguing that the allegations made no sense. Brooke Neville's responded to that with a statement accusing him of victim blaming. So there were news agencies that said that she was accusing him of victim blaming. That's legit. But here's an example from the Daily Beast. They said in a subheadline at the top of their own story that Matt Lauer, quote, penned a stunning victim blaming letter against Brooke Neville's. That was them declaring that she is a victim. News agencies are not supposed to do that. Any person of any gender can perpetrate rape and can be accused of rape. So imagine that you are accused of that and you didn't do it, and you say so publicly, and then the media, which is supposed to be about truth, accuses you of victim blaming. When the media operates that way, there is nothing you can do. Last week, I spoke with John Ziegler. He played an instrumental role in Matt Lauer coming forward. John writes for Mediaite, and now he has his own podcast, of course. It's called The Death of Journalism. John believes that when Brooke Neville first reported problems with Matt Lauer, NBC chose to let Matt go for financial reasons and because of what was going on in society. John believes that if NBC had made a different financial calculation, this whole story would have played out differently.
Josh, I'm 1,000% sure of this. Let's pretend Matt had not been fired and Ronan Farrow came out with the exact same book. The incentive structure for everybody is completely different, right? NBC has an incentive to defend Matt, or people around NBC have an incentive to defend Matt. People who want to be on the Today Show have an incentive to defend Matt because Matt still has power. So that whole allegation would have been laughed out of the ballpark. It would never have been taken seriously. It would have been destroyed. In fact, I think Ronan Farrow wouldn't have been dumb enough to go with it. The only reason why Ronan Farrow went forward with this was because he knew he would have a media that was unwilling to push back.
Maybe. I can tell you that I have seen things like that from the inside. When I was at CNN, when there were people who made any kinds of complaints against prominent folks at CNN, CNN defended them like crazy. When people made complaints about ex-CNN people, CNN was perfectly happy to let them. Nothing as serious as rape, though, as far as I know. To be clear, NBC did have a right to fire Matt Lauer. I wrote about this at the time. It was an answer I gave to a question on a website called Quora. My answer was picked up and run as a column at the Huffington Post. I wrote that we don't have all the information about exactly what happened, but that if what was in Variety at the time was accurate, then sure, he should be fired. And he did say that he violated company policy by having this relationship with a fellow employee. Before a tweet sparked the 2017 Me Too movement, I was a columnist for Time. I wrote a piece about having been sexually harassed by a woman at the start of my career. People sometimes abuse power. It's a matter of who has power in any given situation. Men have had more power in workplaces, so there are more instances of men abusing it. Anyway, once the Me Too movement took off, there were people saying that men should not share their experiences, that men should not be heard from. Journalistically, that idea doesn't make sense because the fact that this can happen is also part of the reality, which makes it part of a story. But in the media, lots of people were refusing to mention or look at any times when men might have experienced bad behaviors by women in the workplace. I did an event in New York with Tarana Burke, the founder of Me Too. In that discussion, I mentioned that some people felt that men should not speak out because only women should be heard at that time. She said that's ridiculous, that she originally created Me Too for victims of sexual violence, all victims of sexual violence. She said she knew that boys and men can be victims of sexual violence and women can be perpetrators. But as you heard in a recent episode on the brand Connectome, the media prefers simple binary storylines. The human mind likes to filter things that way. When reality goes against the simple binary that people want to believe in, the media sometimes runs the other way. But it's the media's job to provide truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That brings us back to where this episode started. Coming up, awards and privilege. One more thing on Ronan Farrow. He is often introduced as a Pulitzer winner. His book won a Pulitzer, as did another book on the Harvey Weinstein case. That one was by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey. It's time for a reality check on that stuff. Awards committees don't fact-check work. I say this with self-awareness. Sometimes when you're listening to this show, you might hear a beautiful montage that my producer, Don, put together. Introductions to me at speeches, and you hear mentions of awards. And I appreciate those, and they have nothing to do with accuracy. So if I ever get anything wrong, I will never say, oh yeah, well, I won awards, or ask the media to emphasize that. The Pulitzers in particular, though, are treated as some ultimate badge of honor, even though they have a terrible track record. Recently, Reuters photographers who won a Pulitzer were exposed for their involvements with Hamas, including accepting awards from Hamas and posing for smiling photos. Oh, the Pulitzers are administered by Columbia University, which might be the most radical, ethically failing of all the elite colleges. So, note to the media. First, stop taking Pulitzers so seriously. And second, when you're presented with evidence that a person doesn't fact-check, stop treating them like a golden child of journalism. Speaking of golden children, one more note on Ezra Klein. Here is something else he said in a recent episode of his podcast. He was speaking with an author.
I read actually a fair amount of it in Berlin and Poland on a trip to celebrate a friend's birthday. But being in these places while reading this book was to really try to imagine all this and how it had happened and how the people around me, their grandparents and great-grandparents, could have done this to my great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents. And I thought a lot about what allows you to dehumanize other people. There's a really startling moment in your book where I forget who says it, but he says about the extermination of the Jewish people that it never occurred to him and the people around him to have any attitude towards it aside from indifference.
Remember how he claims to care about context, about giving people a framework in their minds to understand information? What you just heard there, he pushed that idea over and over, that the framework for understanding the Jewish people of Israel today is to look at Nazi-era Germans. That is insane in so very many ways, starting with the idea that the Jews of Germany did not launch a terrorist attack against Germans. The Jewish people were part of Germany, wanting to follow the laws of Germany and be Germans, not take over Germany and kill Germans. But what struck me the most about what he said there was privilege. First, there's the obvious kind. Most people could not pick up and go to 2 other countries to celebrate someone's birthday, but whatever, he has those resources. It doesn't really matter. The privilege runs much deeper. The people he is trashing by misrepresenting data, saying that the vast majority of them have become indifferent. These people are doing more than any other group of people to ensure that people like him can survive. Thousands of years of history show the same thing. Societies turn on minorities. The people of Judea choose to remain a minority, not try to make people be like them, like us. There is one place in which this tiny group of people can fight to exist. A tiny stretch of land with no oil. Hamas and Iran in general are genocidal against Jews. That is factual and obvious. Gazans overwhelmingly support Hamas in repeated surveys. And of course, there's suffering in Gaza. Having a position on individual actions throughout the war, go for it. If you have any expertise, he doesn't seem to know anything about the military. I don't have military expertise. I listen to experts. That is analysis and opinion. That does not entitle him or anyone to cast the majority of Israel's population as indifferent when they are literally fighting for the right of this tiny group of people to survive. And unlike the rest of the world, Israel went and fought for the survival of the Druze minority in Syria as the new Islamist government there launches genocidal efforts against them. Jewish people in Israel are also fighting against the genocide of Christians in Africa. And Jewish people in Israel are overwhelmingly supportive of getting food to the enemy, even as the enemy starves their hostages. He recently complained that American Jews no longer understand one another. That is a hell of a claim, and it goes against what so many people in the Jewish community describe, which is a newfound sense of solidarity since the October 7th massacres. But either way, there are a lot of people who want to believe that he is right in everything he says. Here is what they and he need to understand. No matter how you feel, truth exists. Facts plus context. You are not misunderstood. What you are is wrong. All right, folks, as always, I would love to hear from you. There are two great ways to reach me. The best is through the newsletter, and the second is through a form at my website. Coming up next week, a big turning point for Ukraine and Russia. Also, an important look at news coverage of China and something that a Murdoch-owned newspaper is doing that the Washington Post is refusing to do, and what that says about American politics right now. As always, thank you so much for listening. I will see you